Why is this useless old man here? We don't have space for him. Those words cut through my heart like a knife, spoken by my own son-in-law in front of everyone at the luxury condominium's entrance. I'm Daniel Moore, 81 years old, and I never imagined that visiting my daughter would lead to the most humiliating moment of my life. My name is Daniel, and I've lived my entire life working the land. For 60 years, my wife Martha and I have called a small farm in rural Kansas our home. It's not much to look at. Weathered wooden fences, a farmhouse that's seen better decades, and soil that's grown more stubborn with each passing year. But it's ours, built with calloused hands and sustained by pure determination. Martha is 78, 3 years younger than me, but we've aged together like two trees growing side by side. Our roots intertwined so deeply that neither could survive without the other. Her hair has turned silver, and arthritis has bent her fingers, but her eyes still sparkle when she talks about our daughter Sarah, our only child who moved to the big city 15 years ago. Sarah, my little girl, who used to chase fireflies in our backyard, who would sit on my lap while I read her stories by the old kerosene lamp. She married Richard Blackwood 5 years ago, a man I never quite understood. He wore expensive suits, drove cars worth more than our annual farm income, and spoke about things I couldn't grasp. Stock options, investment portfolios, market volatility, but Sarah seemed happy, and that was enough for me. The farm hasn't been kind to us these past few years. The drought of 2022 nearly broke us, and the medical bills from Martha's hip surgery last year drained what little savings we had left. We've been surviving on Social Security and the small income from selling eggs and vegetables at the local farmers' market. When Sarah called last month, her voice bright with excitement, she insisted we come visit her new home in Chicago. "Dad, you and Mom have to see this place. It's incredible, and I want to show you around the city. Please, it's been too long." I was hesitant. Martha and I hadn't left the county in over 10 years, and the thought of navigating a big city terrified me. But Martha's face lit up at the possibility of seeing our daughter, and I couldn't deny her that joy. "We can't afford the trip, sweetheart," I told Sarah during that phone call, the weight of our financial situation heavy in my voice. "Don't worry about that, Dad. I'll send you the bus tickets. Please just come. I miss you both so much." So here we were, after an exhausting 12-hour bus ride, standing in front of a gleaming glass tower that seemed to stretch endlessly into the Chicago skyline. The Millennium Towers, that's what the gold letters on the building read. Martha clutched my arm, her eyes wide with wonder and intimidation. "Daniel, look at this place," she whispered. "How can people live so high up in the sky?" I was thinking the same thing. Back home, our highest point was the old oak tree in our front yard. This building made me dizzy just looking up at it. The lobby was like nothing I'd ever seen, marble floors so polished they reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging above, leather furniture that probably cost more than our pickup truck, and security guards in uniforms that looked more expensive than my Sunday best. We approached the front desk, our worn suitcases looking painfully out of place among all this luxury. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that seemed practiced, looked us up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she doubted it. "We're here to see our daughter Sarah Blackwood," I said, trying to stand a little straighter. "She lives in—" I fumbled for the piece of paper where I'd written down the apartment number. "Unit 4207, Martha supplied quietly. The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, whether with recognition or something else, I couldn't tell. "And you are?" "Daniel and Martha Moore. We're her parents." She picked up a phone and dialed. "Mrs. Blackwood, your parents are here in the lobby?" There was a pause. "Yes, ma'am. I'll send them up." As we waited for the elevator, I noticed other residents walking through the lobby, men in tailored suits speaking into wireless earphones, women carrying designer handbags that probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget. Everyone moved with purpose and confidence, and I felt increasingly like we didn't belong. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor made my ears pop. Martha gripped my hand tightly, and I could feel her trembling slightly. We were both way out of our depth. When the elevator doors opened, we found ourselves in a hallway with thick carpet and artwork on the walls. Everything was so clean, so perfect, so different from our simple life back home. We found apartment 4207 and knocked. Footsteps approached from inside, and then the door opened to reveal our daughter. Sarah looked beautiful, her hair professionally styled, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Martha's entire wardrobe. But something in her eyes seemed different. Nervous, maybe, as she looked at us standing there with our old suitcases. "Mom, Dad," she said, but her enthusiasm seemed forced. She hugged us both, but I noticed how quickly she pulled away. "You made it. Come in, come in." The apartment was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the entire city, furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and more space than our entire farmhouse. But despite its beauty, something felt cold about it, sterile almost. "Sarah, this is incredible," Martha said. Her voice filled with awe as she turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "Thank you. Mom, Richard and I have worked very hard for this." Sarah's voice carried a hint of pride, but also something else I couldn't identify. "Where is Richard?" I asked, setting down my suitcase carefully on the pristine white marble floor. Sarah's expression flickered. He had to step out for a moment. "Business call." You know how it is. I didn't, actually. Back home, when the sun set, work was done. But I nodded anyway. We spent the next hour with Sarah showing us around the apartment. 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a kitchen with appliances I didn't recognize, and a balcony that made me dizzy to look over. It was impressive, but I kept thinking about how empty it felt compared to our little farmhouse filled with decades of memories. "Are you hungry?" Sarah asked. "I can order something from the restaurant downstairs." "Order?" Martha asked. "Don't you cook, honey?" Sarah laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Mom, we have 3 different restaurants in the building. Plus, Richard prefers that I focus on other things." I was about to ask what those other things were when we heard a key in the lock. Sarah's entire demeanor changed, her shoulders tensed, and something that looked like fear flashed across her face. "That's Richard," she said quietly, almost to herself. The door opened, and Richard Blackwood walked in, talking loudly on his phone. He was exactly as I remembered. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. But when he saw us, his expression darkened. He ended his call abruptly and stared at us for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Sarah," he said, his voice eerily calm. "What are they doing here?" The way he said "they" made it clear he wasn't talking about invited guests. "Richard, I told you they were coming to visit," Sarah said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You told me they might come. You didn't tell me they were definitely coming, and you certainly didn't tell me they'd be staying here." Martha and I exchanged glances. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Well, of course they're staying here," Sarah said, trying to sound confident. "They're my parents." Richard's jaw tightened, and he looked at us like we were something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. Then he turned back to Sarah, and his voice rose. "We talked about this, Sarah. We have the charity gala tomorrow night, and the Hendersons are coming for dinner on Saturday. This is not the time for family visits." The way he said "family" made my blood start to boil, but Martha's hand on my arm kept me quiet. "Richard, please," Sarah said, glancing nervously between him and us. "They've come all this way. They should have called first. Made proper arrangements. We can't just have people showing up unannounced." "People?" I finally spoke up, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "We're not people, son. We're Sarah's parents." Richard turned to me, and for a moment I saw something in his eyes that chilled me, not just dislike, but disgust. "Right," he said slowly. Sarah's parents. From the farm. The way he said farm made it sound like a dirty word. What happened next would replay in my mind for weeks to come. Richard walked toward the door, clearly expecting us to follow, and then he said the words that would change everything. "Look, I don't know what Sarah told you, but this isn't going to work. We don't have space for guests right now, and frankly, this isn't the right environment for people like you." "People like us?" Martha asked quietly. "You know what I mean," Richard said, his mask of politeness finally slipping completely. "This is a high-end building. There are standards to maintain, images to protect." I felt my hands clenching into fists, a rage building inside me that I hadn't felt since my army days 50 years ago. But it was Sarah's face that stopped me cold. The shame, the embarrassment, the way she couldn't meet our eyes. "Sarah," I said quietly, "is this how you feel too?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. My daughter, the little girl I'd taught to ride a bicycle, to drive a car, to believe in herself, stood there in her expensive dress in her $1 million apartment and couldn't answer. Richard, however, had plenty to say. "I think it's best if you find accommodations elsewhere," he said, already moving toward the door. "There are plenty of hotels downtown that would be more suitable." Suitable? The word exploded from my mouth before I could stop it. "We're talking about family here, not some business transaction." "Everything is a business transaction," Richard shot back. "And this particular transaction isn't working for anyone involved." I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to defend us, to stand up to her husband, to remember who she was and where she came from. But she just stood there, staring at the floor, tears beginning to form in her eyes. That's when I realized the horrible truth. She was ashamed of us. Martha must have realized it too, because I heard her sharp intake of breath. In that moment, standing in that beautiful, cold apartment, I felt poorer than I ever had in my life. Not financially poor. I'd been that for years, and it never bothered me. But soul poor, heart poor, stripped of the dignity I'd carried for 81 years. "Come on, Martha," I said quietly, picking up our suitcases. "We're not wanted here." "Dad, wait." Sarah finally spoke, but her voice was weak, unconvincing. "No, sweetheart," I said, looking at my daughter with a mixture of love and heartbreak. "Your husband has made himself very clear, and so have you, by saying nothing." As we walked toward the door, Richard stepped aside to let us pass, but not before saying one more thing that would haunt me. "Next time, call ahead. Save everyone the embarrassment." The elevator ride down seemed to take forever. Martha cried silently beside me, and I stared at my reflection in the polished steel doors, seeing an old man who suddenly looked every one of his 81 years. When we reached the lobby, the same receptionist who'd looked down on us earlier watched us leave, with what might have been sympathy, or might have been relief. Outside, Chicago's cold wind cut through our farm coats like they were made of paper. We stood on the sidewalk with our suitcases, two elderly people completely out of place in the big city, with nowhere to go and no idea how to get there. "What do we do now, Daniel?" Martha asked, her voice small and lost. I honestly didn't know. We had maybe $40 in cash, no credit cards, and no idea how to navigate this massive city. The bus back home didn't leave until Monday, 3 days away. But as I stood there, watching my daughter's building stretch up into the gray Chicago sky, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't over. Richard Blackwood had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd underestimated what an old farmer was capable of when his family was on the line. Before we continue with Daniel's story, if you're finding this emotional journey compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more real-life stories that touch the heart. Standing on that Chicago sidewalk, I felt like a man drowning in plain sight. Cars rushed past us, their drivers probably never noticing two elderly people with worn suitcases looking completely lost. The city noise was overwhelming. Horns honking, sirens wailing in the distance, the constant hum of traffic that never seemed to stop. Back home, the loudest sound at this time of day would be the evening chorus of crickets. Martha was shivering, and it wasn't just from the cold. I could see the shock in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she clutched her old purse. In 60 years of marriage, I'd seen her face every kind of hardship, failed crops, sick livestock, the death of her parents, even the miscarriage we never talked about. But I'd never seen her look so broken. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the city noise. "Did we do something wrong? Did we raise her wrong?" The question hit me harder than Richard's words had, because deep down, I was wondering the same thing. How had our little girl, who used to defend wounded birds and wouldn't let us kill spiders in the house, grown up to watch her own parents get humiliated without saying a word? "No, sweetheart," I said, putting my arm around her shoulders. "We raised her right. Somewhere along the way, she forgot." A young man walking past us slowed down, probably noticing how out of place we looked. He had kind eyes and reminded me of the boys from our neighborhood back home. "Excuse me," he said, stopping. "Are you folks okay? You look a little lost." I was about to brush him off. Pride runs deep in men my age. But Martha's condition changed my mind. She needed to sit down, needed to get warm, needed to process what had just happened to us. We're looking for a place to stay," I admitted. "Somewhere not too expensive." The young man looked at our suitcases, at Martha's pale face, and something in his expression softened. "There's a family-run motel about 6 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, but it's clean, and the owners are good people. Mrs. Chen, she runs it with her husband. She sometimes gives discounts to folks who need a break. He gave us directions, even offered to help us with our bags, but I wasn't ready to accept that much charity from a stranger." We thanked him and started walking, Martha leaning heavily on my arm. Those 6 blocks felt like 6 miles. Martha's arthritis was acting up, and every few steps she'd wince and slow down. People rushed past us, everyone in such a hurry, and I couldn't help but think about how different things were back home, where neighbors would stop to help without being asked. The Sunset Motel looked exactly like what you'd expect from the name. Tired, but honest. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, and the parking lot had seen better decades. But it was warm inside, and Mrs. Chen, a small Asian woman in her 60s, greeted us with genuine kindness. "You folks need a room?" she asked, and when she saw Martha's condition, her entire demeanor shifted into motherly concern. "Oh, honey, you look exhausted. Come, sit down here while we get you settled." The room rate was $45 a night, which would eat up most of our cash in 2 days. Mrs. Chen must have seen the calculation in my eyes because she quietly said, "First night is $35. Senior discount." I knew there was no such discount, but I was grateful for the dignity she was allowing me to keep. The room was small and simple. 2 beds with worn but clean comforters, a tiny table and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. It was nothing like the luxury we'd just left behind, but it felt more welcoming than Sarah's apartment had. Martha sat heavily on one of the beds and finally let herself cry properly. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere I'd never seen her hurt before. I sat beside her and held her, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't know what to say. "He called you useless," she said between tears. "That man called my husband useless." And she just stood there. "I know, sweetheart. I know. We worked so hard, Daniel. Remember when Sarah wanted to go to college and we took out that second mortgage? Remember when she needed a car for her first job and you sold your father's watch? We gave her everything we had." I remembered. I remembered it all. The sacrifices we'd made gladly because we believed in our daughter, believed she would make something of herself. And she had, hadn't she? She'd gotten her degree, married a successful man, lived in a place most people could only dream of. But somewhere along the way, She'd forgotten the price of those dreams. I called the bus station from the motel's phone. They charged 50 cents for local calls. But I needed to confirm our return tickets. The next bus to Kansas wasn't until Monday morning. 3 more nights in Chicago, 3 more nights at $35 each, plus food. We had maybe $20 left after tonight. What are we going to do for food? Martha asked, as if reading my thoughts. There was a McDonald's next to the motel. I'd seen the prices in the window. We could probably manage 1 meal a day if we were careful. The thought of Martha, who'd cooked 3 meals a day for 60 years, having to survive on fast food, made my heart ache. That's when the phone in our room rang. Martha looked at me with hope in her eyes. Maybe it's Sarah. Maybe she came to her senses. I picked up the receiver, my heart pounding. Hello, Dad? Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. Sarah. Dad, I'm so sorry about what happened. Richard, he was just stressed about work and— Don't, I said, cutting her off. Don't make excuses for him. There was silence on the other end. Then, where are you staying? I almost lied. Almost said we'd found a nice hotel, that we were fine, that we didn't need anything from her or her husband. But Martha was looking at me with such hope that I couldn't do it. Sunset Motel on Wellington Street. Another pause. Dad, that's not a good area. It's what we can afford, sweetheart. Let me send you some money. I can wire it to— No. The word came out harder than I intended. We don't need your money, Sarah. But, Dad, what we needed was for our daughter to stand up for us. What we needed was for you to remember who you are and where you came from. Money can't fix that. I heard her crying softly on the other end. I wanted to say something, I did. But Richard, he gets so angry when things don't go his way, and I couldn't handle a fight right then. So you let him handle us instead. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Because that's exactly what it was. It's not that simple, Dad. The expectations— I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice anymore. What about your expectations of yourself? What about the values your mother and I taught you? That's not fair. What's not fair, Sarah, is your husband calling me useless in front of everyone. What's not fair is you standing there saying nothing while he humiliated us. What's not fair is having to explain to your mother why her only child was ashamed to be seen with her. Martha was crying again, quietly, and I realized I was probably making things worse. But I couldn't stop. 60 years of bottled-up frustration with how the world treated people like us, people who worked with their hands and lived simply, was pouring out. I have to go, Sarah said suddenly. Sarah, wait, I can't do this right now, Dad. I can't. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone for a long moment before hanging up. Martha was watching me with red-rimmed eyes. She's scared of him, she said quietly. I'd been thinking the same thing. The way Sarah had tensed when Richard walked in. The way she'd seemed to shrink into herself. The fear in her voice when she tried to defend us. It reminded me of something I'd seen before, in other marriages, other women. Maybe, I said. What are we going to do, Daniel? I looked at my wife, this woman who'd stood by me through everything, who'd never asked for more than I could give, who deserved so much better than to be treated like an embarrassment by her own daughter. And I made a decision that would change everything. We're going to survive these 3 days, I said, and then we're going home. But before we leave, I'm going to make sure Richard Blackwood understands exactly what kind of man he really is. Martha looked at me with concern. Daniel, what are you planning? I don't know yet. But that man thinks we're useless old people who don't matter. I'm going to prove him wrong. Outside our motel room window, Chicago glittered in the evening light. Somewhere up in one of those towers, my daughter was living a life built on money and status, probably crying into her expensive pillows. And somewhere else, her husband was probably laughing about how easily he'd gotten rid of the old farmers. He had no idea what was coming. That night, as Martha slept fitfully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and planned. I might be 81 years old, I might be poor, and I might be out of my element in this big city. But I'd survived the Korean War, 40 years of farming, and every challenge life had thrown at me. Richard Blackwood was about to learn that you don't mess with a man's family and walk away clean. The next morning brought no mercy. I woke up before dawn, as I had every day for the past 60 years. But instead of the familiar sounds of roosters and wind through wheat fields, I heard sirens, garbage trucks, and the endless hum of a city that never truly slept. Martha was still asleep, her face peaceful for the first time since we'd arrived. I decided to let her rest and walked quietly to the small window. The parking lot was already busy with people heading to work. Men in suits, women in professional clothes, everyone moving with purpose. I wondered if any of them had ever spent a night worrying about whether they could afford breakfast. I'd been thinking all night about what to do. Part of me wanted to just endure the next 2 days quietly, get on that bus Monday morning, and pretend this whole trip never happened. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard Richard's voice. Why is this useless old man here? I'd fought in Korea. I'd built a life from nothing. I'd raised a daughter who'd become successful beyond anything Martha and I had ever dreamed of. I wasn't useless, and I wasn't going to let anyone treat me like I was. The motel had a small lobby with coffee and day-old pastries, complimentary for guests. Mrs. Chen was behind the desk, and she smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Mr. Moore, you're up early." "Old habits," I said. "Farmers don't sleep in." She poured me a cup of coffee without asking. It wasn't great coffee, but it was hot and free, and right now that mattered more than taste. "Your wife is a sweet lady," Mrs. Chen said. "Yesterday when you were checking in, I could see she was hurting. Not just tired, hurting in here." She touched her chest. "Family problems?" I don't know why I opened up to this stranger. Maybe because she was kind, maybe because I desperately needed someone to talk to who wouldn't judge me. "Our daughter," I said. "We came to visit her and her husband. Let's just say we weren't welcome." Mrs. Chen nodded knowingly. "I see this sometimes. Children who do well, they sometimes forget where they came from. They think success means leaving the old life behind completely. How do you handle that? When your own family is ashamed of you?" She was quiet for a moment, wiping down the counter that was already clean. "My son graduated from Northwestern University," she said finally. "Big lawyer now, makes more money in a month than we make in a year. For a while, he didn't want his friends to know his parents ran a motel. Thought it was beneath him. What changed? His daughter, my granddaughter, she got sick, very sick. He needed help, not just money help, but real help. The kind that only comes from family who loves you no matter what. That's when he remembered that success without family is just loneliness with expensive furniture." Her words hit me hard. I thought about Sarah's apartment, all that beauty, all that luxury, but not a single family photo I could see. Not one picture of her childhood, her wedding with us in it. Nothing that connected her to who she used to be. "Maybe your daughter will remember too," Mrs. Chen said gently. "Maybe. But her husband won't let her." Mrs. Chen's expression hardened slightly. "Ah, one of those. The kind of man who thinks love means control." I was about to ask her what she meant when Martha appeared in the doorway, looking small and lost in yesterday's clothes. My heart broke a little more seeing her like that. Martha had always taken pride in her appearance, even when we couldn't afford much. She'd iron her dresses carefully, pin her hair just so, carry herself with quiet dignity. Now she looked like what Richard probably saw, a poor old woman out of her element. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, going to her. "Mrs. Chen has coffee and some pastries." Martha managed a small smile for Mrs. Chen, but I could see the sadness still heavy in her eyes. "Thank you, dear. You're very kind." We sat at a small table in the lobby, sharing a blueberry muffin and planning our day. We had maybe $15 left, and we needed to eat at least once more. The McDonald's next door had a $1 menu. We could probably manage lunch if we were careful. I want to see Sarah again, Martha said quietly. Martha, I need to talk to her alone. Without him there. She's still my daughter Daniel. Underneath all that expensive clothing and fancy apartment, she's still the little girl who used to cry when she accidentally stepped on ants. I understood. Martha needed closure, needed to try one more time to reach our daughter. And maybe she was right. Maybe without Richard's intimidating presence, Sarah would remember who she really was. How do we do that? We can't exactly show up at her door again, Martha was thinking, her fingers drumming on the table the way they always did when she was working through a problem. She works, doesn't she? Some kind of charity organization. I remembered Sarah mentioning it during one of our phone calls. Something about fundraising for children's hospitals. I'd been proud of that. It sounded like the kind of work the Sarah we'd raised would do. The Chicago Children's Foundation, I said. I think that's what she called it. Mrs. Chen overheard us. Oh, I know that place. Downtown, near the river. A very nice building. My neighbor's daughter works there too. She says it's a good organization. Within an hour, we were on the bus, heading downtown. The ride cost us $4 total. Money we couldn't really afford, but Martha was determined. I watched the city pass by through the window. So many buildings, so many people, all living lives I couldn't imagine. The Chicago Children's Foundation was housed in a beautiful converted warehouse with huge windows and modern artwork. Through the glass, I could see people in business attire moving around with tablets and phones, everything looking efficient and important. How do we find her? Martha asked. I approached the security desk. The guard, a middle-aged black man with kind eyes, looked up from his newspaper. Help you folks? We're looking for Sarah Blackwood. She works here and we're her. We're visiting from out of town. Something in his expression suggested he'd seen plenty of family visits that didn't go smoothly. Let me call up. Can I get your names? Daniel and Martha Moore, he dialed and waited. Sarah? I have Daniel and Martha Moore here to see you. A pause. Okay, he hung up. She'll be right down. We waited in the lobby, Martha clutching her purse nervously. Other people came and went. Young professionals, delivery people, visitors who clearly belonged in a place like this. We stood out like flowers in a wheat field. When the elevator opened, Sarah stepped out, wearing a navy blue business suit that probably cost more than our monthly Social Security check. She looked professional, successful, every inch the kind of daughter parents dream of having. But her face was pale and her eyes were red-rimmed. Mom, Dad, she said quietly. What are you doing here? We need to talk, Martha said simply. All of us. Somewhere private. Sarah looked around the lobby, clearly uncomfortable with the attention we might be drawing. There's a coffee shop across the street. Would that be okay? The coffee shop was one of those trendy places where a simple cup of coffee cost $5. Sarah ordered for all of us, without asking what we wanted, and I was grateful. I'd been dreading having to count out change in front of her. We sat at a corner table, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Martha reached across and took Sarah's hand. Tell me the truth, honey. Are you happy? The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She started to give what sounded like a prepared answer, then stopped. Yes, of course I'm happy. I have everything I ever wanted. That's not what I asked, Martha said gently. I asked if you're happy. Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Mom, it's not that simple. Adult life is complicated. There are expectations, responsibilities. Are you afraid of him? I asked bluntly. Sarah's head snapped up. What? No. Dad, Richard isn't. He's not what you think. What do I think? You think he's some kind of monster because he has money and success. But he worked hard for everything he has. He came from nothing, just like you did. Men who come from nothing usually have more respect for people who are still there, I said. Not less. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee absently. When she finally looked up, I saw something in her eyes that reminded me of the little girl who used to confide in us about everything. "He wasn't always like this," she said quietly. "When we first met, he was different, kinder, but success changed him. The more money he made, the more important he became in his company. The more he started to see people in terms of their utility." "Including you?" Martha asked. Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Especially me. I'm his wife. I'm supposed to be an asset, not a liability. And having parents who are poor farmers from Kansas," she shrugged helplessly. "We're not a liability, sweetheart," I said. "We're your family, I know that. In my heart, I know that. But living in Richard's world, it's hard to remember sometimes. Everything is about image, about networking, about who you know and what they can do for you." I leaned forward. "Is that the life you want?" The question hung in the air between us. Sarah stared into her coffee cup like it might hold the answer. "I don't know anymore," she whispered. "I used to know exactly what I wanted. I wanted to help children, to make a difference. And I do good work at the foundation. But at home," she trailed off. "What happens at home, Sarah?" Martha asked gently. Sarah was quiet for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He controls everything. What I wear, who I talk to, how I spend my time. He says it's because he loves me, because he wants us to be successful together. But sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing a little more each day." Martha and I exchanged glances. This was worse than we'd thought. "Yesterday, when we showed up unexpectedly," I said carefully, "he was angry. He was furious. After you left, She touched her arm unconsciously, then caught herself. "He made it very clear that family visits needed to be planned in advance. Approved in advance. Sarah," Martha said urgently, "you can come home with us. Right now, today." Sarah's laugh was hollow. "And what? Live in your farmhouse that's falling apart? Go back to making $20,000 a year and shopping at thrift stores?" "Mom, I can't. I don't even remember how to live that way anymore." "But you remember how to be happy that way," I said. "You remember what it felt like to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back at you." Sarah started crying then. Not the polite tears of yesterday, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Other customers in the coffee shop turned to look, but I didn't care. My daughter was breaking apart right in front of me, and all the money and success in the world couldn't fix what was wrong. "I'm so sorry," she whispered between tears. "I'm so sorry about yesterday. I'm so sorry about who I've become." Martha moved around the table to hold her, and for a moment Sarah was just our little girl again, seeking comfort from her mother. But then she pulled away, wiping her eyes and straightening her expensive suit. "I have to go," she said. "I have a meeting at 2 and Richard will be calling to check on me. Sarah, I can't. Dad, I want to, but I can't. I've made my choices, and I have to live with them." She stood up, then paused. "I love you both. I want you to know that. Despite everything, despite how I've acted, I love you." Then she was gone, walking quickly toward her building, leaving Martha and me sitting in a coffee shop that cost more than we could afford, watching our daughter choose her prison over her freedom. "We're losing her," Martha said quietly. I watched Sarah disappear into the crowd of downtown Chicago. "No," I said firmly, "we're not losing her. But Richard Blackwood is about to lose everything. It was time to stop being the victim in this story. It was time to remind a successful man what failure really looked like." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 20 years. I went to the library and used a computer. Martha was resting back at the motel, emotionally drained from our encounter with Sarah, but I was energized in a way I hadn't felt in years. Seeing my daughter trapped, watching her choose fear over family, had ignited something in me that I'd thought was long dead. The Chicago Public Library was massive, intimidating, and full of people who clearly knew what they were doing. I approached the information desk feeling like the country mouse I was, but the young librarian was patient and kind. "I need to use a computer to look up some information," I said. "Of course. Do you have a library card?" I didn't, but she helped me get a temporary visitor's pass. Within minutes, I was sitting in front of a screen, trying to remember everything Sarah had taught me about the internet during her last visit home 3 years ago. It took me an hour to figure out what I was looking for, but once I did, the information came flooding in. Richard Blackwood wasn't just successful, he was ruthless. His investment firm, Blackwood Capital Management, had been involved in 3 major scandals over the past 5 years. Nothing that stuck legally, but enough to paint a picture of a man who would do anything to win. The most interesting discovery was from 2 years ago, an article in the Chicago Business Journal about a deal that had gone bad. Richard had convinced a group of elderly investors to put their retirement savings into a high-risk investment that failed spectacularly. The article mentioned that several of the investors had lost their entire life savings. One name caught my attention: Harold Chen, 68. Lost $180,000, his entire retirement fund. Chen and Mrs. Chen at the motel had mentioned her husband was retired, that they'd had some financial difficulties a few years back. It couldn't be a coincidence. I printed out the article. It cost me 50 cents I couldn't afford, and headed back to the motel. I found Mrs. Chen in the small office behind the front desk, working on what looked like bills. She looked up when I knocked. "Mr. Moore, how was your visit with your daughter?" "Complicated," I said. "Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something personal? Your husband, is his name Harold?" Her expression changed immediately. "Why do you ask?" I showed her the printed article. She read it, her face growing pale, then looked up at me with something between anger and sadness. "How did you find this?" "I was researching my son-in-law, Richard Blackwood. He's the one who humiliated my wife and me yesterday." Mrs. Chen sank into her chair. "He's your son-in-law?" "Unfortunately, yes. Mr. Moore, that man destroyed our lives. Harold worked for 40 years as an electrician. We saved every penny for retirement. When Mr. Blackwood came to us with his investment opportunity, he seemed so knowledgeable, so trustworthy. He promised us our money would be safe. What happened? The investment failed within 6 months. Harold's health couldn't take the stress. He had a heart attack. We had to sell our house, our car, everything. This motel is all we have left, and we're barely keeping it afloat." I stared at her, pieces of a larger picture falling into place. "Mrs. Chen, how many other people were affected?" "At least 20 families that I know of. All older people, all trusting this man with their life savings. An idea was forming in my mind, dangerous, probably stupid, but potentially brilliant. Do you still have contact information for any of these people?" Mrs. Chen looked at me suspiciously. "What are you thinking, Mr. Moore?" "I'm thinking Richard Blackwood is about to learn what happens when you mess with the wrong old people." That evening, I laid out my plan to Martha. We were sitting on one of the motel beds, sharing a McDonald's value meal, our one meal of the day, and I could see the skepticism in her eyes. "Daniel, this sounds crazy, and possibly illegal." "Nothing illegal about it," I assured her. "We're just going to give Richard Blackwood a taste of his own medicine. But what if it backfires? What if it makes things worse for Sarah?" That was the question that had been keeping me up at night. But after seeing my daughter that morning, seeing the fear in her eyes and the way she'd chosen her cage over her freedom, I knew things couldn't get much worse. "Martha, that man is destroying our daughter piece by piece. He's isolated her from her family, controls every aspect of her life. And from what I read today, he's been destroying other families for years. Someone needs to stop him." Martha was quiet for a long time, picking at her French fries. Finally, she looked up at me. "What do you need me to do?" The next morning was Saturday, the day Richard had mentioned having dinner with the Hendersons, whoever they were. I'd spent the night making phone calls from the motel's payphone. tracking down the other victims of Richard's investment scheme. Mrs. Chen had been right. There were 23 families in total, all elderly, all devastated by their losses. Some had been too proud to pursue legal action, others couldn't afford lawyers. But all of them were angry, and all of them were willing to listen to what an old farmer from Kansas had to say. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. We were going to give Richard Blackwood a public reminder of his past, right in front of the people whose opinion mattered most to him. Mrs. Chen had discovered that the Hendersons were Richard's biggest clients, a wealthy couple who represented about 30% of his business. They were coming to dinner at 7 p.m., along with 2 other important clients and their wives. At 6:30 p.m., Martha and I positioned ourselves across the street from the Millennium Towers, along with 12 other elderly people. Harold Chen was there, looking frail but determined. Dorothy Martinez, 74, who'd lost her husband's pension fund. James Patterson, 82, who'd had to move in with his daughter after losing his house. We all carried signs, nothing fancy, just poster board and markers we'd bought at a drugstore. The messages were simple. Richard Blackwood stole our retirement. BCM destroyed 23 families. Where's our money, Richard? The security guards at the building noticed us immediately, but we were on public property, not causing any disturbance beyond holding signs. They made some phone calls, but couldn't do anything to move us. At 6:45, a black limousine pulled up. Through the tinted windows, I could see several well-dressed people getting out. One of them was Richard. He spotted us immediately. I watched his face change from confusion to recognition to absolute fury. He said something to his companions, probably trying to dismiss us as random protesters, but then Harold Chen stepped forward and called out, "Richard, remember me?" "Harold Chen, you promised our money was safe." Richard froze. His companions, who I assumed were the Hendersons and the other clients, looked from him to us with growing concern. "You told me I'd have a secure retirement," Dorothy Martinez added, her voice carrying across the street. "Instead, I'm working at 74 because of you." Richard tried to hurry his guests into the building, but it was too late. The damage was done. I could see the questions in their eyes, the doubt creeping in. As they disappeared into the lobby, Richard turned back to look at us. Even from across the street I could see the rage in his expression. But there was something else there too. Fear. Sarah's laugh was hollow. "And what? Live in your farmhouse that's falling apart? Go back to making $20,000 a year and shopping at thrift stores? Mom, I can't. I don't even remember how to live that way anymore. But you remember how to be happy that way," I said. "You remember what it felt like to look in the mirror and recognize the person staring back at you." Sarah started crying then. Not the polite tears of yesterday, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Other customers in the coffee shop turned to look, but I didn't care. My daughter was breaking apart right in front of me, and all the money and success in the world couldn't fix what was wrong. "I'm so sorry," she whispered between tears. "I'm so sorry about yesterday. I'm so sorry about who I've become." Martha moved around the table to hold her, and for a moment Sarah was just our little girl again, seeking comfort from her mother, but then she pulled away, wiping her eyes and straightening her expensive suit. "I have to go," she said. "I have a meeting at 2, and Richard will be calling to check on me." "Sarah, I can't." "Dad, I want to, but I can't. I've made my choices, and I have to live with them." She stood up, then paused. "I love you both. I want you to know that. Despite everything, despite how I've acted, I love you." Then she was gone, walking quickly toward her building, leaving Martha and me sitting in a coffee shop that cost more than we could afford, watching our daughter choose her prison over her freedom. "We're losing her," Martha said quietly. I watched Sarah disappear into the crowd of downtown Chicago. "No," I said firmly. "We're not losing her. But Richard Blackwood is about to lose everything. It was time to stop being the victim in this story." We maintained our vigil for 2 more hours. Several news photographers showed up. Mrs. Chen had called the local papers, and by the time we left, I was confident that Richard's dinner party had been thoroughly ruined. But the real victory came the next morning. Martha and I were having our complimentary coffee in the motel lobby when Sarah burst through the door. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, the first time I'd seen her in casual clothes since we'd arrived, and her face was flushed with anger. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said calmly. "Would you like some coffee?" "Dad, don't play games with me. Richard came home last night furious. He said there were protesters outside our building, calling him a thief. He said you were behind it." "He wasn't wrong." Sarah stared at me. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The Hendersons left before dessert. They're threatening to pull their account. Richard is talking about filing restraining orders, pressing charges for what? Exercising our First Amendment rights? Dad, you don't understand. When Richard gets angry, really angry, he doesn't just lash out at the person who caused it. He lashes out at everyone around him." I saw the fear in her eyes and understood what she wasn't saying. "Did he hurt you, Sarah?" She touched her wrist unconsciously, the same gesture from yesterday.
It's not...
"It's complicated." "No," Martha said firmly, standing up. "It's not complicated at all. A man who hits a woman is a coward, period." Sarah's composure cracked. "You don't understand the pressure he's under. His business, his reputation, is more important than your safety." I asked. "You've made everything worse." Sarah exploded. "I was handling it. I was finding a way to manage things, to keep the peace, and now what? Now he knows he can't control everyone? Now he knows there are consequences for his actions?" Sarah stared at me for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. Then she said something that broke my heart all over again. "I have to go. I have to get home before he realizes I'm gone." She turned toward the door, then stopped. "Dad, please. No more protests. No more. Whatever you're planning, just leave. Go home tomorrow like you planned, and forget about us." "I can't do that, sweetheart." "Why not?" "Because you're my daughter, and I love you too much to watch you disappear." Sarah stood there for a moment, crying silently. Then she walked out without another word. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed the entire exchange, came over to where Martha and I sat in stunned silence. "She's more trapped than I thought," Martha said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "But we just proved that Richard Blackwood isn't untouchable." And that was only the beginning. Mrs. Chen looked at me with concern. "Mr. Moore, what are you planning now?" I smiled grimly. "Tomorrow is Sunday. Richard probably thinks the worst is over. He has no idea that old farmers know something about patience, about planning, and about finishing what they start." "Daniel," Martha said warningly, "don't worry, sweetheart. I'm not going to do anything that will hurt Sarah, but I'm going to make sure Richard Blackwood understands that actions have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences come from the most unexpected places." Outside, Chicago was waking up to another day, but for Richard Blackwood, I was about to make sure it would be a day he'd never forget. Sunday morning brought rain to Chicago, the kind of cold, steady drizzle that seeps through your clothes and chills your bones. Martha and I had spent our last night at the Sunset Motel, and in a few hours we'd be boarding the bus back to Kansas. But I wasn't finished with Richard Blackwood, not by a long shot. I was in the motel lobby, nursing my second cup of Mrs. Chen's weak coffee and reading the Chicago Tribune, when I saw it. Page 3 of the business section, "Investment firm faces new scrutiny after protest." The article was brief but damaging. It mentioned the elderly protesters, quoted Harold Chen about losing his retirement savings, and noted that Blackwood Capital Management had previously faced allegations of questionable investment practices. Most importantly, it mentioned that the protest had occurred during a client dinner, disrupting important business relationships. Mrs. Chen appeared beside me, reading over my shoulder. "That's good news, right?" It's a start, I said. But Richard Blackwood didn't get where he is by being easily intimidated. He's going to retaliate. I was right. The retaliation came at 10:30 a.m. in the form of a phone call to our room. Mr. Moore. The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. This is Attorney Jessica Walsh representing Richard Blackwood. I'm calling to inform you that if you continue your harassment campaign against my client, we will be filing for restraining orders and pursuing charges for stalking and defamation. Lady, I don't know what you're talking about, I said calmly. Yesterday was a peaceful protest on public property. Last I checked. That was still legal in America. Mr. Moore, let me be very clear. My client is a prominent businessman with significant resources. If you persist in this behavior, we will use every legal tool at our disposal to stop you. We will also be investigating your financial situation and looking into any potential fraud in your disability or Social Security claims. The threat was clear. Mess with Richard, and they'd find a way to destroy what little financial security Martha and I had. Are you threatening me? I asked. I'm informing you of the consequences of continued harassment. The line went dead. Martha had been listening from the other bed, her face pale. Daniel, maybe we should just go home. Maybe we've done enough. I looked at my wife, this woman who had stood by me through everything, who deserved to spend her final years in peace, not worrying about lawyers and legal threats. Part of me wanted to agree with her, to pack our bags and pretend this whole nightmare had never happened. But then I thought about Sarah touching her wrist, about the fear in her eyes, about the way she'd begged us to just forget about her. No, I said, we haven't done enough, not nearly enough. At 11 a.m. I walked into the business center of a nearby hotel, one of those places where traveling salesmen and consultants worked on their laptops. It cost me $5 for an hour of internet access, money we couldn't afford, but I had work to do. I spent the next hour researching everything I could find about Richard Blackwood's business. His company website, his professional associations, his social media presence, his clients, his competitors. By the time I was finished, I had a clearer picture of his world, and more importantly, his vulnerabilities. Richard wasn't just a successful investor. He was a social climber, desperate to be accepted by Chicago's elite. His Instagram account was full of photos from charity galas, country club events, and society gatherings. He served on the boards of 3 different charitable organizations. His entire identity was built on his reputation as a respectable, trustworthy businessman. That reputation was his weakness. I made a list of every organization Richard was associated with, every charity board he served on, every social club where he was a member. Then I started making phone calls. The first call was to the Chicago Children's Foundation, where Sarah worked. I'd like to speak to someone about one of your board members. Richard Blackwood, I told the receptionist. May I ask what this is regarding? I represent a group of elderly investors who lost their retirement savings through Mr. Blackwood's investment firm. We're concerned about having someone with his track record associated with a children's charity. I was transferred to 3 different people before finally reaching someone with authority, a woman named Patricia Hoffman, the foundation's executive director. Mr. Moore, I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Blackwood has been a generous supporter of our organization. Without more specific information, ma'am, I can send you copies of newspaper articles documenting the losses suffered by 23 elderly investors. I can provide you with contact information for the victims. And I can tell you that yesterday, when confronted by some of these elderly people, Mr. Blackwood refused to even acknowledge their losses. There was silence on the other end. I'll look into this, she said finally. The second call was to the Lake Shore Country Club, where Richard was a member. The third was to the United Way, where he served on the advisory board. The fourth was to Chicago Magazine, which had featured Richard in a 40 Under 40 article 2 years earlier. By the time I finished my calls, I'd spoken to representatives from 7 different organizations. I'd provided each of them with the same information, documented evidence of Richard's investment failures, contact information for his victims, and newspaper coverage of yesterday's protest. I wasn't asking anyone to take action. I wasn't making accusations. I was simply providing information and expressing concern about having someone with Richard's track record in positions of community leadership. It was 1 p.m. when I returned to the motel. Martha was packed and ready to go. Our bus left at 3 p.m. But she could see something had changed in my demeanor. "What did you do, Daniel?" "I planted some seeds," I said. "Now we wait to see what grows." We were loading our suitcases into Mrs. Chen's car. She'd offered to drive us to the bus station when my phone rang. It was Sarah, and she was crying. "Dad, you have to stop this. Please, you have to stop. What's wrong, sweetheart?" Richard got a call from the Children's Foundation. They're putting his board appointment under review. The country club wants to meet with him about concerns raised by community members. "Dad, you're destroying his life." He destroyed his own life the moment he started stealing from elderly people. It's not that simple. Those investments, they were risky but legal. People knew there were risks. Sarah, listen to yourself. You're defending a man who stole retirement money from people like Harold Chen, and then you're going home to that same man who hurts you when he's angry. He doesn't hurt me. Not really. When he's stressed, stop. I said firmly. Just stop. I've heard enough women make those same excuses, and it never ends well. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Then what do you want from me, Dad? What do you want me to do?" "I want you to remember who you are. I want you to look in the mirror and ask yourself if the woman staring back at you is someone you're proud of." "I can't just leave him. You don't understand. He controls everything. Our bank accounts, our credit cards, the apartment lease. I have nowhere to go. You have us, living in a falling-down farmhouse in Kansas, making minimum wage. Dad, I can't go backwards like that. It's not going backwards. Sarah, it's going home." The call ended with Sarah crying and me feeling like I'd failed her all over again. But an hour later, as Martha and I sat in the bus station waiting for our departure, my phone rang again. "Mr. Moore, this is Patricia Hoffman from the Chicago Children's Foundation. I wanted to follow up on our conversation from this morning." "Yes, ma'am." "We've conducted a preliminary review of the information you provided. While we can't take immediate action based solely on these allegations, we've decided to suspend Mr. Blackwood's board appointment pending a more thorough investigation." I felt a surge of satisfaction. "Thank you for taking this seriously. Mr. Moore, can I ask you something? Are you Sarah Blackwood's father?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes, ma'am, I am. She's a wonderful employee, very dedicated to our mission. But lately she seemed troubled, stressed. I hope she knows that if she ever needs support, we have resources available. I'll make sure she knows that." After I hung up, Martha looked at me with concern. "Daniel, what if this makes things worse for her at home?" "It will," I said honestly. "Things are going to get worse for Sarah before they get better. But sometimes you have to break something completely before you can rebuild it properly." Our bus was called, and we began the long journey back to Kansas. As Chicago disappeared behind us, I thought about Sarah, alone in that beautiful prison she called home, with a husband who was probably just discovering how much damage an old farmer could do in 3 days. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This isn't over, old man. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Stay away from my family or you'll regret it, Richard." Somehow he'd gotten my number, probably from Sarah's phone. The threat was clear, but it didn't scare me. If anything, it told me I was on the right track. Desperate men make threats. Guilty men lawyer up. And Richard Blackwood had just done both. I showed the message to Martha. She read it and shook her head. He really thinks he can intimidate you, doesn't he? He's about to learn different, I said. This war is just getting started. The bus rumbled through the Illinois countryside, carrying two elderly passengers who looked defeated but were anything but. Richard Blackwood thought he'd won by running us out of town and threatening us with lawyers. He had no idea that he'd just declared war on a man who'd spent his entire life fighting for what mattered most, family. And this old farmer was far from finished fighting, because when we got home, I was going to do something I should have done years ago. I was going to learn everything there was to know about my son-in-law's business, his past, and his secrets. And then I was going to use that information to set my daughter free, whether she wanted to be freed or... The farmhouse had never looked so small and shabby as it did when we returned from Chicago. After 3 days in the big city, even staying at a rundown motel, our home felt like stepping back in time 50 years. The peeling paint on the front porch, the sagging fence line, the old pickup truck that wheezed and coughed like an elderly dog, it all looked different through eyes that had seen luxury, but it was home. And more importantly, it was where I was going to plan Richard Blackwood's downfall. Martha went straight to bed, exhausted by the emotional toll of the weekend. At 78, she didn't have the energy reserves she once did, and seeing Sarah trapped in that marriage had drained what little strength she had left. I tucked her in like she was a child, kissing her forehead and promising her that everything would be all right. But I had work to do. Our old desktop computer, a hand-me-down from Sarah, when she upgraded 5 years ago, sat dusty and neglected on the kitchen table. It took 15 minutes just to boot up, and the dial-up internet connection was slower than molasses in January. But it was enough. I spent the entire night researching Richard Blackwood and Blackwood Capital Management. What I found made my blood boil. The scheme was more sophisticated than I'd initially thought. Richard didn't just target random elderly investors. He specifically sought out people who were recently widowed, recently diagnosed with serious illnesses, or facing financial difficulties. He presented himself as a financial savior, offering investment opportunities that promised high returns with minimal risk. The investments themselves were real, but they were far riskier than Richard let on. When they failed, which they did more often than not, Richard would claim that market conditions had been unprecedented and unforeseeable. He'd express sympathy for his clients' losses while simultaneously collecting hefty management fees that were buried in the fine print. Harold Chen wasn't the only victim. I found records of dozens of elderly people who'd lost their life savings to Richard's schemes. Some had tried to sue, but Richard's lawyers had buried them in paperwork and legal costs until they gave up. Others were too ashamed or too poor to fight back. But the most damning discovery came at 3 a.m. when I stumbled across a bankruptcy filing from 2018. Richard Blackwood had personally declared bankruptcy 7 years ago, claiming over $2 million in debts. Yet somehow, within 2 years, he was living in luxury and running a successful investment firm. The math didn't add up. Unless I dug deeper, following a trail of shell companies, offshore accounts, and suspicious transactions. By the time the sun rose over our wheat fields, I had a pretty clear picture of what Richard Blackwood really was. Not just a predatory investor, but likely a criminal who'd been using his clients' money to fund his own lifestyle. Martha found me at the kitchen table at 7 a.m., surrounded by printed articles and handwritten notes. My eyes red from staring at the computer screen all night. "Daniel, have you slept at all?" "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Too much to think about." She looked at the papers scattered across the table. "What is all this?" I explained what I'd discovered. The pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly victims, the suspicious financial recovery after bankruptcy, the likelihood that Richard was running what amounted to a Ponzi scheme. Martha sat down heavily in her chair. "So he really is stealing from people. Worse than that. I think he's been using new investors' money to pay fake returns to existing investors, while skimming off enough to fund his luxury lifestyle. It's a classic pyramid scheme, and when it collapses, which it will, hundreds of people are going to lose everything. What are you going to do? I looked at my wife, this woman who'd stood by me through 40 years of farming, good times and bad, and made a decision that would change both our lives. Forever. I'm going to bring him down completely, and I'm going to save Sarah in the process. The first call I made was to the FBI's Chicago field office. I'd like to report suspected investment fraud. I told the agent who answered, "Can you hold for financial crimes?" Within 10 minutes, I was speaking to Special Agent Maria Santos, who listened patiently as I explained what I'd discovered about Richard Blackwood's business practices. "Mr. Moore, these are serious allegations. Do you have documentation to support them?" "I have newspaper articles, bankruptcy filings, victim testimonies, and evidence of a pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly investors. I can send you everything I've compiled. Please do. But I have to warn you, financial fraud investigations take time. We're talking months or possibly years before any action is taken. Agent Santos, my daughter is married to this man. Every day he remains free. He's hurting more people and tightening his control over her. Isn't there anything that can be done sooner?" There was a pause. "Mr. Moore, if you believe your daughter is in immediate physical danger, that's a different matter entirely. Do you have evidence of domestic abuse?" I thought about Sarah touching her wrist, the fear in her eyes, the way she'd shrunk when Richard walked into the room. "I have suspicions, strong suspicions, but no proof. Then my hands are tied. Send me everything you have on the financial crimes, and we'll open an investigation. But you need to understand, this is a marathon, not a sprint." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone, frustration building in my chest. The FBI would investigate eventually, but eventually wasn't good enough for Sarah. That's when the second idea hit me. If I couldn't get Richard arrested quickly, maybe I could destroy him financially. And I knew exactly how to do it. I called Mrs. Chen at the motel. "Mr. Moore, how are you? How is your wife?" "We're fine, Mrs. Chen, but I need your help with something. How many of Richard's victims do you think would be willing to file complaints with the Securities and Exchange Commission?" There was silence on the other end. "Then what are you planning?" "A coordinated attack on his business license. If 20 or 30 victims file complaints simultaneously, it'll trigger an automatic review of his firm's practices. Even if he's not doing anything technically illegal, the investigation alone will destroy his reputation and scare away his clients." "You really think this could work?" "I think Richard Blackwood's entire life is built on the illusion of success and respectability. If we shatter that illusion, everything else will come crashing down." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Moore, my husband had another heart attack last month. The stress of losing our retirement money, it's killing him slowly. If there's a chance to stop this man from hurting other people, there is. But I need your help coordinating with the other victims. Can you do that?" "Yes, give me a week." The next 7 days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and paperwork. Martha helped when she could, but mostly she watched with concern as I threw myself into the campaign with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I contacted victim advocacy groups, researched SEC complaint procedures, and even reached out to investigative journalists at 3 different newspapers. By Friday, we had commitments from 28 victims to file simultaneous complaints against Blackwood. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On Saturday afternoon, while Martha was tending to her garden and I was reviewing complaint forms for the 100th time, my phone rang. "Dad." Sarah's voice was different, smaller, more frightened than I'd ever heard it. "Sarah, sweetheart, what's wrong?" "Dad, I think I'm in trouble." "Real trouble?" My heart stopped.
"What kind of trouble?"
He's been asking me to sign papers. Financial documents. He says it's just routine business stuff, but I think he's been using me to hide money. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of papers, Sarah? Bank account authorizations, investment account transfers, corporate documents for companies I've never heard of. And Dad, some of these accounts have millions of dollars in them. My mind raced. If Richard was using Sarah's name on fraudulent financial documents, she could be facing criminal charges along with him when the house of cards finally collapsed. Sarah, where are you right now? I'm at work. Richard thinks I'm in a meeting. But Dad, I'm scared. Last night, he got a call from someone about irregularities in some client accounts. After he hung up, he was so angry, and he started talking about having to accelerate the timeline. Accelerate what timeline? I don't know, but this morning I saw him packing files into boxes. Important files. And he booked a flight to the Cayman Islands for next week. The pieces clicked together in my mind. Richard was getting ready to run. He'd probably been planning it for months, using Sarah's name to hide assets offshore, and now that the pressure was mounting, he was preparing to disappear with stolen money while leaving her to face the consequences. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. You need to get out of there today, right now. Dad, I can't just leave. Where would I go? What would I do? You come home to us, to Kansas. I don't have any money of my own. Richard controls all our accounts. We'll figure that out later. Right now, you need to get somewhere safe. But what about my job? My life here? Sarah, if Richard disappears and leaves you holding financial documents with your signature on them, you could go to prison. Do you understand that? The silence on the other end told me she did. There's something else, Dad. Last night, Richard got another call. After he hung up, he looked at me and said something that scared me. He said that if things got complicated, he might need to simplify his situation. What does that mean? I think he was talking about getting rid of me, permanently. The words hit me like a physical blow. Richard wasn't just a financial criminal. He was potentially dangerous to my daughter's life. Sarah, pack a bag right now. Don't go home. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Just get on the next bus to Kansas. Dad, I'm too scared to go home and pack. What if he's there? I thought quickly. Do you have any money at all? Cash, credit cards, anything? I have about $60 in my purse and a credit card, but Richard monitors all the statements. Use the cash. Buy a bus ticket with cash. Leave everything else behind. We'll replace whatever you need. But Dad, Sarah, this isn't a discussion. Your life may be in danger. Get on that bus and call me when you're on your way. 2 hours later, my phone rang. Dad, I'm on the bus. I'm coming home. I closed my eyes and said a prayer of thanksgiving. After all these years, all this heartbreak, my daughter was finally coming home, but I also knew that Richard Blackwood wasn't going to let her go without a fight. And when he discovered she was gone, things were going to get very dangerous, very quickly. I looked out the window at our little farm, our sanctuary that was about to become a battleground. Richard might have money, lawyers, and resources we couldn't match, but he'd made one critical mistake. He'd threatened a farmer's family, and this old farmer was about to show him what happened when you backed a desperate man into a corner on his own land. The final confrontation was coming, and this time I was ready for it.